The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the bustling harbor. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop, and from it stepped none other than Barack and Michelle Obama. Dressed elegantly yet casually, they carried an air of calm anticipation as they prepared for a long-awaited vacation. It wasn't just any trip. It was their first escape from the relentless demands of public life in years. Before them stood the Elysium, a majestic cruise ship that gleamed like a floating palace. Its pristine white hull rose high above the dock, with rows of golden lights illuminating its many decks. The air was alive with excitement as fellow passengers boarded, exchanging smiles and laughter with the sharply dressed crew. The scene promised luxury, peace, and the kind of serenity the Obamas had been yearning for. But even amidst the grandeur, a subtle unease lingered. As the couple approached the boarding line, a uniformed crew member briefly hesitated when taking their passports. Her polite smile wavered for just a moment before she glanced at a supervisor, who gave a curt nod. Michelle noticed the exchange, but brushed it off, choosing instead to focus on Barack's reassuring smile. Once on board, the ship's interior was nothing short of spectacular: grand staircases, glittering chandeliers, and sprawling lounges that overlooked the vast ocean. For a moment, Michelle allowed herself to relax, taking in the beauty. Yet, as they moved through the ship, small irregularities began to surface. Their assigned suite, a premium room, was stunning but lacked the ocean view they had specifically booked. The receptionist's apology was polite but dismissive, a stark contrast to the warm treatment they had observed other guests receiving. Still, Barack remained composed, reminding Michelle to stay optimistic. As the evening unfolded, the couple dined in a lavish hall where guests mingled freely. However, the staff's demeanor toward them was markedly different. Service was slow, smiles were absent, and warmth was replaced by an almost mechanical efficiency. Michelle couldn't help but wonder, was this just a coincidence? Or was something more sinister at play? The Elysium promised an unforgettable journey. Little did they know, it would indeed be one, but not for the reasons they had hoped. Before we dive into the next part of this incredible story, let's take a moment. If you're enjoying the journey so far, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue sharing these compelling stories with you. Now, let's get back to uncovering what happens next aboard the Elysium, a journey that's about to take a shocking turn. As Barack and Michelle Obama stepped onto the luxurious cruise ship Elysium, the initial awe of its grandeur quickly gave way to a subtle but undeniable undercurrent of discomfort. From the moment they handed over their passports to the crew, it was clear that their experience would be far from the warm and inclusive atmosphere the cruise promised. The first sign was slight, almost imperceptible. A uniformed staff member, who had been beaming while greeting other passengers, suddenly hesitated as she scanned the Obama's passports. Her polished smile faltered for a split second before she turned to her supervisor, who gave her a curt nod. The couple was then directed toward the embarkation area, but not with the same cheerful demeanor offered to the other guests. Michelle exchanged a glance with Barack, both silently acknowledging the shift in energy but deciding not to make assumptions just yet. Their unease grew as they checked into their suite. Instead of the premium ocean view accommodations they had meticulously reserved, they were directed to a less desirable room overlooking a lifeboat storage area. When they brought up the discrepancy with the receptionist, his response was polite but dismissive. "Unfortunately, your original suite is unavailable due to a booking error," he explained, offering a generic apology. "This suite is equally luxurious, and we'll do our best to accommodate any concerns." Michelle's polite but firm response was met with indifference. It was clear that rectifying the situation was not a priority for the staff. The dining experience that evening only compounded their concerns. While other guests enjoyed attentive service, laughter, and warm conversations with the crew, the Obamas were met with slow service, curt interactions, and a distinct lack of hospitality. A waiter delivered their meals with mechanical efficiency, avoiding eye contact and offering no small talk. Michelle, known for her sharp observations, couldn't ignore the difference. "This can't be a coincidence," she whispered to Barack as their waiter hurried away. "I'm noticing it too," Barack replied calmly, though the tension in his voice hinted at his own growing frustration. "But let's see how things play out." The following morning brought more of the same. At the breakfast buffet, a server intercepted them with forced politeness and guided them to a table far from the scenic views enjoyed by other passengers. Again, the lack of warmth was palpable. When they ordered coffee, the delay was inexplicably long, and when it finally arrived, the server barely acknowledged them before retreating. It wasn't just one incident, it was a pattern. By the time they attempted to visit the ship's spa later that day, Michelle's patience was wearing thin. Despite having booked treatments in advance, they were informed that their reservations couldn't be found. As they waited for clarification, Michelle overheard a staff member muttering dismissively to a colleague. "They probably got confused about the times," the staffer said, rolling her eyes. Michelle's anger flared, but Barack placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Let's address this calmly," he said, though even he was finding it hard to stay composed. The subtle but persistent signs of discrimination were no longer deniable. From the mismanaged accommodations to the lack of basic courtesies, the Obamas found themselves treated as outsiders in a place that prided itself on luxury and inclusivity. Despite the mounting frustration, they resolved to observe and document the incidents carefully, understanding that their response would set the tone for what was to come. What started as a quiet vacation was quickly becoming an unsettling journey through the darker undercurrents of prejudice and exclusion, even in the most luxurious of settings. As the days aboard the Elysium unfolded, the subtle signs of discrimination began to evolve into blatant acts of exclusion and hostility, leaving Barack and Michelle Obama grappling with the reality of their situation. What had started as microaggressions now became impossible to ignore. On the third day of the cruise, the couple decided to attend a highly anticipated wine tasting event hosted in the ship's elegant dining hall. The event, advertised as an inclusive gathering, promised a tour through the finest vintages curated by world-class sommeliers. However, upon their arrival, the Obamas were greeted with a frosty reception. A hostess at the entrance glanced at their invitation and frowned. "I'm sorry," she said flatly, "but this event is already at capacity. Perhaps you can attend the next one." Michelle, who had meticulously planned their itinerary, knew the claim was false. She gestured to the half-empty hall behind the hostess and calmly replied, "We have reservations, and there are clearly seats available." The hostess hesitated, her discomfort evident, but before she could respond, a senior staff member intervened. "It's fine, let them in," he said, his tone begrudging and far from welcoming. Once inside, the atmosphere was no better. While other attendees were engaged in lively conversations with the sommeliers, the Obamas were largely ignored. When they attempted to ask questions about the wines, their inquiries were met with curt responses. One sommelier even turned away mid-conversation to attend to another group. "This is getting ridiculous," Michelle murmured to Barack, her frustration barely contained. The tension escalated further during an evening gala, the crown jewel of the cruise's social calendar. Guests were encouraged to dress in formal attire and mingle on the grand ballroom's marble floors under shimmering chandeliers. The Obamas, known for their grace and poise, arrived impeccably dressed, ready to enjoy the evening. However, as they moved through the crowd, they noticed an undeniable pattern. Other passengers seemed to avoid them, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A few whispered behind their hands, their glances not as subtle as they might have thought. When the couple approached a table to join the conversation, one of the passengers, a middle-aged man in a crisp tuxedo, looked up and said, "Oh, I believe these seats are taken." Michelle raised an eyebrow, noting the vacant chairs and untouched drinks. "Really?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Yes," the man replied, his tone clipped. Barack placed a reassuring hand on Michelle's shoulder, signaling that they should move on. But the interaction left a bitter taste, one that lingered throughout the evening. The breaking point came when the couple attempted to voice their concerns to the ship's management. They scheduled a meeting with the cruise director, a polished individual who radiated charm, until the conversation turned serious. We've noticed a pattern of behavior that's deeply concerning. Barack began, outlining the incidents they had experienced. The cruise director listened politely, but responded with an air of dismissiveness. I'm sorry to hear you feel that way, Mr. and Mrs. Obama, he said, his tone betraying no real concern. However, I can assure you that any perceived issues are purely coincidental. We pride ourselves on offering equal treatment to all our guests. Michelle leaned forward, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. This isn't about perception. This is about consistent, deliberate behavior that's impossible to ignore. We're not looking for apologies. We're looking for accountability. The director's polite facade faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. I'll make a note of your concerns, he said curtly, rising to signal the end of the meeting. As the couple left the office, Michelle turned to Barack. They're not going to do anything, are they? No, Barack replied, his expression grim. But that doesn't mean we stop speaking up. The tension aboard the Elysium reached a boiling point as word of their complaints began to spread among the crew and passengers. Some avoided them entirely, while others seemed emboldened to act more overtly hostile. One evening, they returned to their suite to find a note slipped under their door. It read, "Maybe you don't belong here." Despite the growing hostility, the Obamas refused to be silenced. They began documenting each incident meticulously, preparing to take their story public if necessary. Their resolve turned the cruise into a battleground, not just for their dignity but for a broader fight against prejudice in spaces that claimed to be inclusive. The air aboard the Elysium had grown heavy with tension. By now, the Obamas' ordeal had reached nearly every corner of the luxurious cruise liner. Rumors of their complaints and the ship's unwillingness to address them had sparked quiet conversations among some passengers and open hostility from others. It was clear that the situation could no longer be ignored. Determined to address the issue head-on, Barack and Michelle requested a meeting with Captain Lars Andreen, the ship's commanding officer, known for his decades of experience and stern yet composed demeanor. Captain Andreen was the final authority on all matters aboard the Elysium. The meeting was scheduled for mid-afternoon in the captain's private quarters, a room filled with nautical maps, polished mahogany furniture, and walls adorned with accolades from his long career. The setting exuded authority, but it did little to intimidate the couple. As they entered the room, Captain Andreen greeted them with a practiced smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama, please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to two chairs across from his desk. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Barack began, his tone measured but firm. "We appreciate your time, but we also want to be clear about why we're here." Captain Andreen leaned back slightly, his expression neutral. "Of course, I understand you've raised some concerns. Please, elaborate." Michelle didn't hesitate. "We've experienced consistent and deliberate acts of discrimination since boarding this ship. From being excluded from activities to receiving hostile treatment from both passengers and staff. It's been impossible to ignore." The captain listened, his face an unreadable mask. When Michelle finished, he nodded slowly. "I've reviewed the reports from my staff," he said, "and while I sympathize with your feelings, I must say that no concrete evidence has been provided to suggest systemic issues aboard this ship." Barack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Systemic issues don't always leave a paper trail, Captain. But when patterns emerge, patterns that disproportionately affect us while leaving others unscathed, it's more than a coincidence." Captain Andreen's composure faltered briefly. "I assure you, the Elysium adheres to the highest standards of equality and hospitality. If isolated incidents have occurred, they will be addressed. But I see no indication of widespread discrimination." Michelle leaned forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Captain, this isn't about isolated incidents. This is about a culture that allows certain behaviors to go unchecked. It's about the note left under our door, the events we're conveniently excluded from, and the stares we endure every time we walk into a room." For a moment, silence filled the room. Captain Andreen tapped his fingers lightly on the desk, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "You must understand. Managing a vessel of this size is an incredibly complex operation. Misunderstandings are bound to happen." Barack leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We're not here to argue the logistics of running a cruise ship. We're here to ensure that everyone aboard this vessel is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Ignoring these issues only perpetuates them." The captain exhaled sharply, the tension in the room palpable. "What exactly would you have me do?" "Start by holding your staff accountable," Michelle said. "Conduct an impartial investigation into these incidents. Review the behavior of your crew, and take action where necessary. And don't stop there. Implement training to prevent this from happening again." Captain Andrine's gaze hardened. "You're asking for a complete overhaul based on allegations." Barak's voice was steady but carried an unmistakable edge. "We're asking for leadership. If you can't acknowledge the problem, you're complicit in it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the captain seemed ready to argue further, but something in Barak's tone stopped him. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean. "I'll consider your requests," he said finally, his voice low, "but I make no promises." "That's a start," Michelle said, standing, "but we'll be watching closely to see if words turn into actions." As they left the room, the Obamas felt a mix of relief and lingering frustration. The confrontation had forced the captain to acknowledge their concerns, but whether it would lead to meaningful change remained uncertain. Little did they know, the fallout from their meeting would soon ripple across the ship, exposing deeper cracks in the Elysium's facade and pushing the conflict to a breaking point. The tension aboard the Elysium reached a boiling point just days after the Obamas' confrontation with Captain Andrine. What had initially been subtle acts of exclusion and whispers behind their backs had escalated into open hostility. Passengers once indifferent now felt emboldened, while some among the staff acted with an air of impunity, sensing the lack of immediate accountability from leadership. The turning point came during the ship's Grand Masquerade Gala, one of the most anticipated events of the voyage. Held in the ship's opulent ballroom, the gala was a spectacle of wealth and elegance, with glittering chandeliers, flowing gowns, and an orchestra filling the air with music. Despite the underlying tension, the Obamas decided to attend, determined not to let the atmosphere rob them of their dignity. As they entered the ballroom, dressed impeccably and holding their heads high, conversations hushed, and dozens of eyes turned toward them. The weight of scrutiny was palpable, but they pressed on, greeting a few passengers who offered polite, if hesitant, nods. Then, it happened. A waiter approached their table with a tray of champagne flutes. As he leaned over to serve them, the tray suddenly tipped, spilling the drinks all over Michelle's dress. Gasps echoed through the room. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the waiter stammered, though the smirk he quickly tried to hide told a different story. Michelle stood, her composure cracking. "Was that an accident?" she asked pointedly. Before the waiter could respond, another passenger interjected. "Oh, come on," a man's voice called from across the room. "Not everything is about you." Laughter followed, sharp and mocking. Barak placed a hand on Michelle's arm, silently asking her to stay calm, but she turned toward the crowd, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't about us. It's about the kind of behavior being tolerated on this ship. And right now, all of you are proving our point." The room fell silent, the weight of her words cutting through the air. But the silence didn't last long. A middle-aged woman in an elaborate mask stood and pointed a finger at Michelle. "You've been nothing but trouble since you got here," she spat. "Always playing the victim, trying to ruin everyone else's vacation." More voices joined in, some agreeing, others shouting for order. The ballroom descended into chaos. Within moments, security staff appeared, led by the ship's first officer, Mr. and Mrs. Obama. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his tone formal but cold. "Leave the gala or leave the ship?" Barak asked, his voice sharp. The officer hesitated. "The captain has made the decision to disembark you at the next port." The words hit like a slap. Michelle's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're evicting us? For what? Standing up for ourselves?" The officer's expression didn't change. "The captain has determined that your presence is causing unrest among the passengers. For the safety and comfort of everyone on board, we must ask you to leave." Barack's jaw tightened. Unrest caused by what? By our skin color? By your refusal to address blatant discrimination? The officer didn't answer, and the silence spoke volumes. As they were escorted from the ballroom, the crowd parted, some passengers looking away in discomfort, others openly glaring. A few murmured words of support, but none loud enough to make a difference. Back in their cabin, the Obamas packed their belongings in silence. The gravity of the situation sinking in, they would be dropped off at the next port, an unfamiliar city far from home. "This isn't the end," Michelle said finally, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "They think they've silenced us, but they're wrong. We're going to make sure the world knows what happened here." Barack nodded, his expression resolute. "We came here for peace, but they've left us no choice. This fight isn't over." As the ship approached the next port, the Obamas stood on the deck, watching the coastline come into view. They weren't just leaving the Elysium. They were stepping into a larger battle for justice, one that would expose the truth about the cruise industry's darker side and challenge systemic inequality on a global scale. Disembarked at the bustling port city of Lisbon, the Obamas stood on the quay, their belongings hastily packed and hearts heavy with the sting of injustice. Despite the humiliation aboard the Elysium, their resolve to expose the truth about what had transpired grew stronger with each passing moment. From the moment they stepped off the ship, they were met with a surprising mix of reactions. A small crowd of dockworkers, local journalists, and curious onlookers had gathered, intrigued by whispers of the high-profile passengers being abruptly evicted. Word had spread quickly, and the sight of the Obamas exiting the ship under escort only fueled speculation. Barack, ever composed, turned to address the crowd. "We've been through a troubling experience," he began, his voice steady but firm. "But this is not just about us. It's about a larger issue, one that affects countless people who've faced discrimination in silence. We intend to speak out, not only for ourselves, but for everyone who's been made to feel unwelcome because of who they are." Cameras flashed, and questions flew, but the Obamas offered no further comments for the moment. Instead, they checked into a nearby hotel, where they began planning their next steps, gathering evidence. The first order of business was documenting everything they'd experienced. Michelle meticulously wrote down every incident, from the microaggressions by passengers to the outright hostility of the staff. Barack, meanwhile, reached out to their legal team and allies in the media. Their story quickly gained traction. The Elysium was a luxury liner known for its exclusivity, and allegations of racial discrimination and mistreatment on such a vessel were shocking. News outlets clamored for interviews, while social media erupted with hashtags like #JusticeOnElysium and #StandWithObamas. But the Obamas knew they needed more than just public outrage. They needed hard evidence. With the help of their legal team, they filed requests for security footage from the ship, records of staff training on diversity and inclusion, and passenger complaints logged during the voyage. Their efforts paid off when a whistleblower from the Elysium's crew contacted them anonymously. This individual provided critical information, emails and memos that revealed a pattern of negligence in addressing discrimination complaints. One email, in particular, stood out: an internal discussion among senior staff where Captain Andreen dismissed concerns about the Obamas, stating, "We cater to our core clientele, and they find this situation unsettling." Allies stepped forward. As the story gained momentum, allies from various sectors began to rally behind the Obamas. Civil rights organizations offered their support, while celebrities and public figures voiced their outrage on social media. Former passengers of the Elysium came forward with their own stories of mistreatment, painting a damning picture of the cruise line's practices. Michelle took to social media to address their supporters directly. In a heartfelt video, she said, "This fight is bigger than us. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their background, feels unsafe or unwelcome in spaces that should bring us together. We've heard from so many of you, and your stories are a reminder that this is a battle worth fighting." Meanwhile, Barack worked with legal experts to explore possible actions against the cruise line. They knew that a lawsuit would be a long and arduous process, but they were determined to hold the company accountable. The cruise line's response, Under mounting pressure, the Elysium's parent company released a statement. It expressed regret over the incident and promised a thorough investigation. But the carefully worded apology rang hollow to many, especially when no immediate actions were taken to address the allegations. The company's CEO appeared on a morning talk show, attempting to downplay the situation. "The Elysium is committed to diversity and inclusion," he said, "and we believe this is an isolated incident." The Obamas, however, weren't satisfied with empty promises. In a press conference, Barack responded, "If this was an isolated incident, then why have we heard from dozens of others with similar stories? This isn't just a failure of individuals. It's a systemic issue that demands real accountability." Turning the tide. As the pressure continued to mount, the Elysium's reputation took a significant hit. Travel agencies began suspending partnerships, and bookings plummeted. The company's shareholders demanded immediate action to mitigate the growing scandal. Facing financial and public relations crises, the cruise line announced sweeping changes. Captain Andreen was placed on administrative leave, and a third-party investigation was launched. The company also pledged to implement mandatory diversity training for all staff and establish an independent body to handle discrimination complaints. But for the Obamas, these measures were just the beginning. They knew that true justice would require systemic change, not just within the cruise industry, but in all spaces where discrimination persisted. A movement is born. As their fight gained global attention, the Obamas used their platform to launch a new initiative, Equity Everywhere, a nonprofit dedicated to combating discrimination and promoting inclusivity in travel and hospitality. Through advocacy, education, and legal action, the organization aimed to ensure that no one else would endure what they had. In the months that followed, the Elysium incident became a turning point, sparking conversations about privilege, bias, and accountability. The Obamas' determination to unveil the truth not only held one company accountable, but also inspired a broader movement for justice and equality. The aftermath of the Elysium incident marked a turning point not just for the Obamas, but for the broader conversation about equality and justice in modern society. Once the dust began to settle, the couple found themselves reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had undertaken, not just across the Atlantic, but through the labyrinth of systemic bias and societal resistance. The story had started as a personal ordeal, but it quickly transformed into a public reckoning. With every interview they gave, every meeting they attended, and every statement they issued, the Obamas saw the world respond, not only with outrage but also with introspection. It wasn't merely about their experience. It was about the countless others who had endured similar indignities, often without the platform to amplify their voices. Barack and Michelle spent weeks sifting through the messages they received. Stories of discrimination from all corners of the globe flooded in, from travelers who had been denied service based on their appearance, to employees in the hospitality industry who felt powerless against entrenched prejudice. The universality of these accounts was heartbreaking but also galvanizing. It became clear that the fight they had waged against the Elysium was part of a much larger battle, one that transcended their personal story. The legal proceedings against the cruise line unfolded slowly but decisively. Though the case itself would take months to resolve, the revelations brought forth during the investigation were damning. Depositions from staff members painted a picture of a culture steeped in implicit bias, where complaints from marginalized groups were routinely ignored or dismissed. Internal emails and memos uncovered during discovery confirmed what many had suspected. This wasn't a one-time failure, but a systemic issue deeply embedded in the company's operations. For the Obamas, the legal victory was significant, but it wasn't the end goal. They knew that lawsuits could punish bad behavior but couldn't, on their own, eradicate prejudice. The couple doubled down on their commitment to change through advocacy and education. Their nonprofit, Equity Everywhere, became a lightning rod for discussions about equity in public and private spaces. Conferences were held, policies were drafted, and alliances were forged with organizations that shared their vision of an inclusive future. In private, Michelle and Barack wrestled with the personal toll of the ordeal. They spoke candidly about the moments of vulnerability they had felt, moments when even their own unshakable confidence wavered in the face of hostility. But they also spoke about the profound resilience they had witnessed, not only in themselves but in the countless individuals who reached out to share their own stories of perseverance and dignity in the face of adversity. What emerged from these reflections was a renewed sense of purpose. The Obamas began to emphasize the importance of small, everyday acts of courage in the fight against discrimination. They spoke about the need for individuals to challenge biases in their own communities and to hold institutions accountable, not just in moments of public scandal, but as a matter of routine practice. Their advocacy began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. Industries beyond hospitality took notice of the Elysium scandal and began re-evaluating their own practices. Corporations adopted stricter anti-discrimination policies. Governments introduced legislation to protect travelers and employees from bias. And grassroots movements sprang up to demand greater accountability from both public and private entities. For Michelle, one of the most poignant moments came during a speech she gave to a group of young activists. "This isn't just about laws or policies," she said. "It's about the world we want to live in, the world we want to leave for the next generation. It's about seeing the humanity in each other, even when it's difficult, and refusing to let fear or prejudice dictate how we treat one another." Barack, too, found solace in connecting with those who had been inspired by their story. In one memorable town hall, he told the audience, "Change is slow, it's frustrating, it's imperfect, but it's also unstoppable, as long as we keep pushing forward." And the beautiful thing about moments like these, moments of challenge and confrontation, is that they remind us of what we're capable of when we refuse to accept the status quo. In the end, the Elysium incident became more than a cautionary tale. It became a catalyst for change. It reminded the world that even in the face of adversity, there is power in speaking out, in standing together, and in demanding better. For the Obamas, it was a chapter that reaffirmed their lifelong belief in the possibility of a more just and equitable world, a belief that, in their words, was not just an aspiration but a responsibility. As they moved forward, they carried the lessons of their journey with them, determined to continue the work they had begun. And in doing so, they reminded the world that progress is always within reach, as long as there are those willing to fight for it.